John with Ripewave Audio, back a fifth time with Denon's latest AV receiver, the AVR-X6800H, which sells for just under $3,500. And this time we are going to explore MultEQ-X, the optional paid application that runs from a PC to calibrate your Denon or Marantz receiver. In this case, it's the Denon 6800. As the paid option for Audyssey, this is said to be the best way to calibrate using Audyssey your Denon or Marantz receiver or processor. And we're going to see if that is the case and ultimately how it compares with Dirac Live and its options. But this MultEQ-X, looking at its web page, it says it does frequency responses, subwoofer level adjustments, cutoff modes, and has a full manual options. Now this continues our series we've done with this new Denon receiver. As the fifth installment, we've done everything from looking at the built-in Audyssey calibration to using Dirac, and then adding in the Dirac's multi-sub option with bass control, looking at the measurements Dirac versus the internal Audyssey of the receiver. Now the Audyssey options, of course, if you're using it built into the receiver, it doesn't cost you any money. You can use an application on a mobile device, which sells for $20. This essentially gives you a little more visibility to what's built into the receiver, but it's still running within the receiver. And it's not until you go to MultEQ-X that you get from the Microsoft Store for $200 that you actually take the processing of the calibration out of the receiver and bring it to your computer. Now let's talk a little bit about how Audyssey has designed and developed MultEQ. Now this is developed entirely by Audyssey. They have a new release every couple of months. Now their default settings, what they seem to be doing, and I've looked at videos, and Joe and Tell has done some good videos on Audyssey MultEQ and Audioholics, and they brought in representatives from Audyssey, so I was hearing directly from the Audyssey representatives, and I've read through the full MultEQ-X manual. It's not that long, it's like 35 pages, and only about 20 of it really gets into the heart of doing the calibration once you get past the licensing sections. But what I've gathered is the default settings are designed to protect your speakers. It's not necessarily designed to give you the best results. They do a lot of things in it by default that is being careful about not overdriving your speakers. If you know what you're doing, you can release those restrictions and perhaps give yourself a little better tuning. They also maintain a balance to 0 dB reference. And this will come up later as we look into what it's doing with some of the adjustments to, let's say, a target curve and how that could be a problem. But this is what they're doing. They're taking across the full spectrum for your subwoofer and your mains to maintain that zero balance of 0 dB. Audyssey does recognize that their strategy is different than that of Dirac and maybe others like Anthem Arc. But comparing against Dirac with its live and bass management and active room treatment and bass control, they just recognize that they have a different strategy. They say it's good that they have a way of doing it. We do things a little different. They're not about trying to copy what all the competing technologies does. And we'll find out if that's a good thing in all cases, some cases, or not at all. Now, the mobile app that I referred to was not developed by Audyssey, and it's only this MultEQ-X application that runs standalone on a PC that is entirely designed by Audyssey. Now, this application, MultEQ-X, is designed for Windows only. It runs on Windows 10 and 11, and it's running from a computer and not your AVR or AV processor. As far as Mac compatibility, They don't have it at this moment. So you can't run this on a Mac, particularly the new M1, where it doesn't even have the Windows compatibility mode. They do say that it's in development, but it's a big effort and they're not putting out a date as of yet. And I think this was maybe a few months ago they were saying that. So we'll see. Now they give you some guidance in their manual. They say, first of all, get your amplifier and preamplifier ready. In this case, it's an AV receiver, AV processor. This is an AV receiver. Make sure your channel assignments are correct. Now, we did this when we went into Dirac as well, so no difference there. So make sure your amp assigns, your pre-outs assigns are all correct. In the case you're running a processor like the Marantz AV10, you may have a polarity to check on the XLR output. If there is a speaker that's disabled, an amp assign, it's not going to show up in MultEQ-X. So it's very important you get those settings correct. And if you happen to change one of these settings after completing a MultEQ-X calibration, then you won't be able to enable MultEQ until you recalibrate and download the new filters. So getting the speaker presets right. So pick your preset. You have two presets, preset 1, preset 2. By default, when you're running through the setup assistant, it's running Audyssey, but it's running it from the AV receiver or processor. If you want to overwrite that, go back to preset 1. If you want to compare the built-in Audyssey to MultEQ-X, put it on preset 2. So that's your choice. But get that speaker layout right, and here's a screen here that's showing your configuration. Take a look at it. Is it set up? Now our room is a 9.2.4 configuration, and this represents what we have. Everything's running in an external amp except for the front wides, which we're using the amps built into the receiver. The next guidance Audyssey provides is on the subwoofer configuration. Here they're talking about on the subwoofer itself. They want you to disable or bypass any low-pass filter that's being present. So it's sometimes labeled LFE or THX on them. Alternately, you can set your frequency maximum or your THX setting. This gives MultEQ-X the most flexibility in calculating the filters and crossover values. They also ask that you disable any auto, standby, or sleep modes on your subwoofer. So to ensure that the subwoofer is there to receive the signals from Audyssey during the calibration process. And of course, if you feel comfortable like we do that our subwoofer is going to stay on, and you'll know it, if it's not responding, it will give some. Right? So I didn't bother. I left mine in auto as it normally is. They say to set the gain controls to their nominal settings, so at the 12 o'clock position. In this photo, it's not in 12 o'clock, but on ours it is, or the THX position. They ask to set the phase or polarity controls to 0 or normal. Now, in our subwoofer, those are disabled anyways if you're using the LFE input. So you might have one of those subs that as soon as you put in an LFE input, it's disabling the phase on the subwoofer. So look for that. But otherwise, go and set that polarity. So then you're all set on your subwoofer side, and you're ready to get into the Audyssey MultEQ-X software. When you open it up, you can create a new configuration or open existing. We're going to create a new because it's a new unit and everything. Now, when you open it up, it's going to show you at least one entry, which is the sample AVR. That's just dummy data to get you used to the product. But if you have a real AV receiver or processor that it's compatible with, and it's on the same network, you should be able to refresh this list and see the units on your network. We have 2. We had our Marantz Cinema 50 already online with Audyssey MultEQ-X from about a year ago. And then we have the Denon AVR-6800H. Now we know we have a license enabled for the Marantz Cinema 50, but it's showing as false. And this is because we haven't signed in yet. So don't panic if you have a license and it's showing as false. You got to sign in first. So once you sign in, it does show on that Marantz Cinema 50 that it is true that we have a license. but the Denon AVR-X6800 doesn't. It's false. So we got to get that license for this unit that we brought in last month. So when we do this, it says you can buy the license. Now, I want to talk about the restrictions on these licenses. I think it's important you understand this before you purchase a license from them. It is unit specific. I couldn't transfer from my Cinema 50 to the Denon X6800 or a Denon X4800 to an X6800. You can't transfer between units, even if they're the same model. The other thing that they put a restriction on is it's owner specific. And I think this is even harder to take, because if I wanted to sell my Marantz Cinema 50 and I had the license for MultEQ-X, I can't sell that Cinema 50 with the license because it was created with my Microsoft Store account. And unless I'm willing to give the new owner my credentials to the Microsoft Store, forget it. They're not going to have that capability unless they also spend $200. So I think this is the harder of the two to take, the way they've set up their licensing model. And I think a lot of you complain that you can't transfer at all. In any case, is a big deal. But gosh, if I sell one of these units, it's not going to the new owner and I can't make use of it. Essentially lost that $200 investment. They do have a return policy. So it looks like a 30-day returns. We can try to do this. I also heard that Audyssey is a little bit flexible. If we call them up with a specific situation, they might be understanding. Because a lot of times we're buying these units, test them out at home, and we don't know if we're going to keep them long term. And if we return them back to the retailer, we don't want to be out that $200 for the license. But I went ahead for the purpose of demonstrating this and bought the license. I don't have a relationship with Audyssey, so I had to buy the $200 license just like everybody else. And with that done, the screen has turned to true for my Denon AVR-6800. So now I can connect to that unit, and when it connects to that, through that IP address, it reads out the speaker configuration. And here it's showing all those speakers that are there. And I can deselect, I believe, but I can't add. I think you want to get it matching. Now, other thing I will point out, if you go to the help screen and check for updates, you can see if there's a new update. There was an update, and I did the update, and it brought me to version 1.6 when I started this in January. And as of February 2nd, it was 1.6. Well, when I was running the calibration on the 3rd, it got disconnected. I didn't understand why. Now, I don't know if it's related to an update, but the next thing I noticed when I restarted is it was at version 1.7 and some change. And when I went to the updates, there's no updates, but it's now at 1.7.854.0 as of February 3rd. So they did recently come up to version 1.7. There wasn't anything real significant that I saw in the release notes, but I wanted to point out that that's the version I'm using. The other thing I'm going to point out right away is autosave. That autosave selection is not selectable until after you save to a file. So go up to Files and save your configuration right away, and then you can turn on autosave. Make sure that's enabled so all these measurements you're doing don't get lost if something should happen to the connection. The other thing that's good is to confirm the settings that are used by your installation of MultEQ-X. When you go to the settings button at the bottom left of the screen, it gives you these choices. So they give you choices for precise trims. This is a good feature. So your Denon Marantz receivers or processors limit to 0.5 increments on your trims. But what if Audyssey wants to do it between hand? So 0.2, 0.3, 0.4. With precise trims selected, you can dial in a 0.7 or 0.8 increment, and Audyssey will use the filters to compensate the lack of fine tuning that's available in the way Denon Marantz save it. So that's a very good one. I recommend just leaving that on. Then there's an override filter cut limit. Now traditionally, MultEQ would limit it to 20 dB, but there's never a problem with cutting a signal. It's when you boost it, that's where you could damage your speakers. You could cut these things as all you want. So by turning this on, and the maximum is 40 decibels, why not just turn it on and set it to minus 40 decibels? And of course, you watch it. And of course, if you're trimming it that much, maybe there's some bigger problem. But there's no harm in overriding the filter cut limit to set it to the maximum of negative 40. And then there's an EQ headroom expansion. Now, traditionally, Audyssey limits that to 9 dB. The new option allows you to have a headroom of up to 24 dB. And again, why not turn that on? They might give you a warning here that you could damage your speaker, but just be careful when you go through your calibration that you're not doing anything wild. You're not boosting something. And I think it's on the boost side, once again, that they're worried so much on. The maintain relative trims. This is where Audyssey really tries to keep everything consistent. Where you have Audyssey turned on or off, those trims are going to be about the same whether you've turned on MultEQ or not. The problem with that is it really limits you on your headroom to the least capable speaker amp combination. So if you have this one speaker that can't do so much, it becomes a problem. So by deselecting it, you can expand this limit, and now you can do a lot more with your calibration. So we recommend turning this off, but again, being careful about not over boosting something. With that turned off, we're ready to go with our calibration. Now to navigate off a connect, you've got to use that navigation on the left and select number 2, adjust sub levels. There's no next button like there is in Dirac. So you go and hit that next item on the menu choice. It takes you to adjust subs. Well, you won't be able to do anything until you have a microphone hooked up to do the measurements. What Audyssey can only use is a microphone plugged in to your front of your AV receiver or processor with a Denon and Marantz product. We do have the microphone that came with the receiver. These are not calibrated. With MultEQ-X, you do have the option to buy a calibrated microphone. And if you do, you'll be given a file and you can load it in with this screen. And once that's done, you're all set. Now here's your option. From Audyssey website, they show you these individually calibrated microphones. You hit the buy now, and they look exactly like the one that comes with it. The only difference is these are calibrated. It takes you to an Amazon store, and I see here it's just under $80. The problem was, and I would have got one of these, it's not going to come until February 20th. I don't have a few weeks. I want to do this review. And what I hear is the one that comes with it is good enough for most application. But for the long term, I would like to get one of these calibrated microphones. And I do hear it makes some slight improvement. Now there is another option. They have their Pro Installer Kit. This is $550, and it looks like you buy it directly from Audyssey. There's an order form. It doesn't take you to Amazon as with the calibrated microphone. You could see all these items that come with the kit. And I heard that CD that comes with it is useless. This is an older kit that they just put out there again. And I don't think they modified the contents of it. But it does have a higher precision microphone than even what you can get from Amazon. So this black microphone that's shown here, the 1/4-inch reference microphone. They give you a calibrated preamp as well, so you can run this longer distances. And that might be useful for some of you who have your receiver and processor in another room, and the length of that microphone cable, you just can't extend it or you'll have too much of a signal loss. So they have this arrangement. If you take all the parts that come with this, the microphone stand, and you put the calibrated mic on the microphone stand, and it has this little holder that works for the microphone stand and gives you this XLR cable that goes to the preamp. They did this with a mini XLR cable, which are harder to find, but you can get them. I wish they had used a regular balanced cable because I have lots of those. But this preamp that they selected only takes mini XLR, and maybe the microphone as well. So the components they selected, maybe they're just all mini XLR, so they had to get a cable that goes with it. And it gets powered, this preamp, for the little wall wart. It comes out of the preamp as mini XLR as well, but your receiver has an 1/8 inch mic jack. So they give you a variety of adapters. You're going to need two, one to take it from XLR to RCA, and then one from RCA to 1/8 inch mic. And then it's getting that microphone finally to the receiver, but you can go long distances with it, and you run your Audyssey app from a PC through Ethernet or through Wi-Fi. When you compare this with Dirac Live lets you plug the MuMic 1 directly into the laptop. You don't go through the receiver or processor. You plug the microphone directly into the laptop, which makes a lot more sense. Now, Audyssey said they're working on it, but that's going to require some engineering effort and maybe some coordination with Denon and Marantz. But the long of it is they don't have it. And so you've got this more complicated setup. By buying the Pro installation kit, $550, Audyssey for $200, you're in it for $750. And then Dirac Live, which usually seems to be pricier than Audyssey, starts looking more attractive unless you buy all the options. But I just appreciate the simplicity of it and going directly into your computer. So with all that out of the way, you have whatever microphone you're going to use, and you're ready to adjust the subs. Now, Audyssey calibrates to 75 dB, not an 85 dB reference. What you want to do is keep your sub levels in the green, so a target of 75. So I connected the microphone, and that little mic connection thing at the top of the screen turns green. And with that turning green, we're ready to hit the start button, either the front or the rear. I have two. If you have four, you would do all four. So I hit the start button, and I started off a little on the high side. It was 79 dBs. So I turned down, I dialed down in the back of the sub, the level, and it brought it down to about 75. Then I did the rear sub, which came out to be about 77 dB. So I brought up the front one to match it. I thought 77 was a little better than 75. Plus, it's harder for me to reach behind the rear sub. So I just kind of cheat a little bit, but still in the green area. Now you're able to click the menu choice of measure on the left-hand menu, and you're presented with this screen. Now, Audyssey can capture up to 32 measurement positions, starting with the main listening position where you're going to sit. Now, looking into the Audyssey manual, they have this chart here that shows suggested positions, but you don't have to use these. But I said, why not? I'll just use what they're showing here. Now, I don't care about anything but my main listening position right now, so that's how I've been doing all these. And they show you the positions, and they recommend, if you have a single seat, do at least 6 positions for a sampling, a little bit away from that main listening position. And they also said vary the heights, not just, so take your stand here. That's why I like this microphone stand. I'll just move it up a few inches and down a few inches at the different positions. And that brings a little more variability into the measurements and the sampling. Now, if you have a smaller room, they said 8 to 10 measurements is more than adequate. If you start doing more than that, it's overkill. But you can do up to 32. Having a plan on how you're going to do the measurements, how many you're going to take, you can move forward. Now, you'll measure the positions. It will capture the audio. As it's capturing the audio, it's going into the receiver first. Once that's complete, it transfers it over to your PC. And you'll see this go through. We'll do the capture, and then it'll do a transfer. And then it'll do the next speaker, capture, transfer, next speaker, capture, transfer, until all the speakers are measured for that position, and it moves on to the next position. And when you get all positions done, and I did 8, you get a result that looks like this, and I'll dissect this screen a little bit for you. You can, for any number of these positions, if you had a bad measurement, you can delete it, remove the position altogether, or you can exclude it. So, if you exclude it, it turns red, and then you can bring it back again and re-include it so you can turn it on and off. You also can put a label on it. Now, default is just a number at 1, 2, 3, 4. But if you want to put a little note that this was a couple of feet or meters from the main listening position to the right and a little inches, if you want to capture those notes, go right ahead. It might help you for your next time, and you can look at that. Now, as you're measuring, it may report a phase error. I find that sometimes that reporting is inaccurate. Now, fortunately, you can bypass any phase error, in which I had to do for a couple of instances on this setup. I know these are not wired out of phase. I use them all the time, but I still visually check to make sure I didn't do something stupid. But in this case, I can just ignore it. It shows that little symbol there, and that will persist as you're doing the calibration. If you exclude all these positions, you're kind of in a full manual, and you can do all this EQ outside of what Audyssey measures. And some of the advanced users like to do that, and some of them feel they can get better results. When it goes through and it aggregates for all the positions, so in 8 positions, they show that aggregate view at the top. And it shows you with this red line where the cutoff is happening. Now, the legend shows it as a gray line, but it's, I think, really a red line. I'm looking at the front right speaker. Now, the front left and right speakers, they're the same make and model. I'm pretty sure that my front right doesn't go down to 20 hertz. The front left, as reported at 40 hertz, I think is more of a reality. So you may have to go in later and correct things that Audyssey got wrong. Now, they have this data smoothing at the top. You can turn that on or off. This is visual only, has no effect on the calibration. If you want to look at it to help you analyze it a little better, you can bump up the smoothing. The default is 12, kind of halfway in between. With your measurements done, we can click on number 4, Design Target Curve. Now, why do you want to design a target curve beyond what's built into this? So there's a high frequency roll-off and a mid-range compensation set by default by Audyssey. But why would you want to change this? Well, it could be your room size. It's outside the normal range, so you could benefit from a different curve there. You want to do some matching of a boost base. This is directly from the manual. Natural boost base for speakers with natural bass boost. So when MultEQ corrects the speaker's response, the result will sound like less bass. Some users will want to retain the emphasis while smoothing the response. Mid-range compensation adjustment. And they also talk about directivity complications that occur such that the perceived sound differs from the measured sound. Of course, I prefer to say, if you prefer it to sound a little different, you want more bass, that's why you're going to adjust the target curve. The language here is a little flowery. So anyhow, this is why you adjust the target curve. You want it to sound a little better. To your own liking, right? You're the one that has to live with this. The next screen might be a little overwhelming because I have a lot of notes on here. But essentially, your curve application, as you're modifying it, you tell the system for this filter that you're creating, is it going to apply to reference and flat? Now, what is reference and flat? These are the curves. If you remember, if you did the onboard Audyssey, that's built into it. You don't have a way to alter reference and flat. That's just what it gives you, unless you use the mobile app. The problem is, Denon and Marantz don't let you rename reference and flat. This is like filters in the Dirac calibration. In Dirac with Denon and Marantz, you have 3 filter slots. Think of this as 2 filter slots that have a name of reference and flat, which you can configure to do anything you want to using MultEQ. I find that a little annoying that I cannot rename reference and flat to what I want it to be. It's really slot 1 and slot 2. Okay. And then this curve, this filter, target curve filter, do you want it to apply to all channels or certain channel groups? Now you do have this little button called individual channels. So instead of just having front, you can individually set a target curve for the front left versus the front right. I don't have a use case for that right now, but maybe as I grow up. It seems to me, regardless of what you do, if you have different target curves for reference versus flat, I think when you send these filters to your AVR AVP, it's always sending the update to reference and flat. So if you didn't bother making one different than the other, they're both going to do the same thing. So you might want to at least make a little variation between the two and compare a setting. I would start with just all channels using the same target curve as your initial point. And as you get experienced, you might learn, hey, I want to tweak my rear speakers and my side surrounds a little different. Well, you can. So they have these things called components. You can add and remove them as desired. You can have as many target curves as you want, and they ultimately aggregate into the profile of what you're going to send to your speakers. And there's several of these, and we'll go over them on the next pages here. But then you have a cutoff mode, and this is applied per speaker group. It uses a Lindquist-Riley cutoff. When you set it to auto on the pair, so front, left, and right, whatever has the higher cutoff is going to use. So notice I had 20 hertz for one of my front speakers, but the other was 40. It's going to use 40. And it's going to do it with a second order high pass filter. Now you can override that, but that's the default. Try to determine where the crossover should be. If you want to set your own, you can select the frequency and the order in which you want that to gradually transition. The first order gives you the longest. So as you go to higher numbers, up to 6, it becomes steeper and steeper, that rollover to the cutoff. What you want to do is match the natural roll-off of your speaker, and that will use less EQ or require less EQ. So look at the curves of your speakers and try to match, have that slope match what your speakers are doing. Or you can disable it and have no cutoff at all. And this is like a full range speaker. Now, your low frequency filter is set by this cutoff mode plus a couple of other elements. When we get to menu choice 5, the filter settings, your low frequency EQ limits or curtains have an impact. And then when you get to 6, the calibration settings, bass management, your speaker size and frequency also influence. So you got these 3 things all working to ultimately come up with your low filter. To me, it's a little confusing. It takes a bit to get used to. Next, I'll call your attention to disable auto leveling. Now, this is a very important topic. Audyssey centers subs and mains around 0 dB reference. And it does this on all the applications, whether you're doing in the receiver, the mobile app, or the MultEQ-X, it's going to center your subwoofer around 0 dB and your mains around 0 dB. This creates a problem because you end up with a step between your subs and your mains, and they're not nicely integrated. They do this to maintain a reference level. But as we've seen here, reference standards today vary so much between sources, whether you're streaming or from one movie to the next or whatever, or you're going from movies to music. I don't think it's something that should be held on to. So this is that philosophy that they've had to keep things always centered around a 0 reference. Weigh in if you feel like that's still important. I'll give you an example here. We're going a little bit ahead. So using one of the components called tilt. And let's say we're applying this tilt. This is a good example. And I got this concept from Joe Intel. His video on MultEQ is very good. He has several of them. And what he talks about here is because your subs, what it's doing with auto leveling is centering the frequencies between 30 and 80 hertz and your mains between 500 and 2000 hertz, what you really end up with in a result is a step after that 80 hertz where the main and the subs are not integrating. By disabling auto leveling and allowing the subs to no longer be on that zero reference alignment, now you can have some continuity and better blending between your subs and your mains. And you can see here on this example here, we look at the estimated plots at the bottom for your subwoofers in particular. So we look at the front and the rear subs. And here is with auto leveling turned on, and see it's around that 0 dB. And if we turn off disable auto leveling, that all goes up. And people wonder why when we use Audyssey, it sounds like bass is being sucked out of your system. I believe this is what is causing it, the auto leveling. And that disintegration between mains and subs. Disable that auto leveling feature, you're going to have better integrations, and you're going to get that real boost that you wanted with the target curve for your subs. A couple of other features on this page. Import EQ. So if you want to do your measurements with a different tool, such as REW, Room Equalization Wizard, and that you can use a UMIC-1 plugged directly into your computer instead of buying a pro calibration kit for the long distances. That's one workaround. You can import the results from REW into here using the import EQ, some feature that they added. You can also import a target curve. So if you want to bring in a Harman curve like we did under Dirac, you can. We'll save that for a later day. Let's take a look at these components now. When you go to add a component to your target curve, you've got these 7 choices. And some of the choices have multiple options. Let's look at these one by one and how they get implemented. So first is a theater high frequency roll-off 1. So there's a slight roll-off of frequencies. And this is designed for small to medium rooms up to 2,500 cubic feet. I don't have the conversion to metric, but I usually like to do that. And here's what this looks like. Now, if you move to a component that is rollout 2, that's designed for medium to large rooms from 2,500 to 5,000 cubic feet. And you notice here the change in that roll-off. And here we can compare those two, and we can see 1 is a little higher frequency, and 2 with the larger room, not as much on the high end, slightly less. There's also the SMPTE 202M, the international standard curve that's used in a 500-seat movie theater, so large rooms over 5,000 cubic feet. And we can see the drop-off here. And then comparing all three, the SMPTE 202M, the larger room, so as the rooms get larger, they're saying drop more of your treble off, more of your high-end frequencies. Now, mid-range compensation is one of those components they have enabled by default. So Audyssey wants to see this usually on everybody's calibration, but I don't think it is for everybody. What they're trying to do here is a lot of speakers have some issues, some directivity differences between the mid-range and the high-frequency drivers. And that's occurring around 2,000 hertz. And this is what they've done, this dip, because you get the speakers with a boost there, with this overlap, and it's trying to compensate for that. So this is what, and you can't change the parameters. You can't change the frequency or the amplitude. This is it. When you put on the mid-range frequency compensation, that's what it does. Now they have something else later on that if you want to create a custom one that positions this in a different place, you can with a PEQ setting. And here we are with the parametric setting. You select the bi-quad parametric. They're using frequency magnitude for all their adjustments to boost or cut the frequency at a specified range, which is over a width of Q. This is much better than a graphical equalizer. This is what you get in Denon Marantz AVRs and AVPs. This is much better, right? So you don't want to be doing it in those receivers and processors. There's also other bi-quad options here. So as we can see here, it's a long list. I think there's like 15 of them. The parametric EQ, and this is a popular one. If you wanted to reproduce that mid compensation, you could use this and alter it the way you wanted to. So essentially, you choose the frequency, the width, which is the Q, and how much gain or cut that you want to apply. So I did a trick here without taking off the mid-range compensation, which looks like the chart that's a little higher on the front, and applying this PEQ to compensate, to take out what the mid-range, to have these fight against each other. But just to prove a point, this boost versus the cut with the mid-range compensation, and you can see that flattens it out a bit with the one below it. Now, other options are low-pass filters. The first one is a first order. I'm doing this out of it's not the order as shown in the menu choice, but I think the logical order that I think about it, right? So with the first order low pass, that's spreading it over a wider group of frequencies. You don't have the ability to change the Q and the gain for this one. Then there's the Butterworth low pass, and this drops off more quickly. And the Lindquist-Riley low pass 2 filter. When we talked about cutoff mode here, that was using Lindquist-Riley as well. This is Lindquist-Riley 2. I don't know quite the difference based off of the one that's built in and this one you're applying to your own custom curve. Maybe it's the same. And then there's a second order low pass filter with Q, which means you can adjust the width. And that gives you more flexibility, but it's giving you that little bit of a bump there, right? Then they have, on high pass filters, again, starting with the first order, spread over a long period, but not adjustable. The Butterworth high pass, which is a little quicker, and a Lindquist-Riley high pass 2. And then finally, the second order high pass with Q. This looks very similar to what we see in Dirac, what they try to do, that little bump when they do that high pass filter on the subwoofer. You see this little bump like that. It looks very similar. The first order low shelf. So you're trying to go from one gain level to another gain level and maintain it. You're not going down to 0, but you're creating a shelf. You got a first order one, and you can adjust the gain. You have a second order one. Again, you can adjust the gain. Again, for both these, it's a fixed width. Then you have the second order low pass shelf, but this time you can adjust the Q and you get that little bit of bump on both sides of it. And then you have a first order high shelf going the other way, raising instead of cutting, and a second order high shelf, and a second order high shelf with Q. A couple more. Dolby elevation. Now, one of the videos I saw with the Audyssey representative, he didn't really know what was going behind the scenes, but this is something explained as Dolby likes to see this put in for elevation speakers. Now, he didn't specify if this was only the Dolby reflective speakers or this is any ceiling or height speakers. And the manual for Audyssey doesn't explain this one. So we need more clarification of why this looks a little funky here. It's happening between 4K and 20K where it's doing this bumpity bump thing. So I don't know. And then finally the tilt. We showed this earlier here. And this is a quick way of getting a good overall tonal balance. This is a popular way to put in a target curve. You can adjust the decibels per octave. And it's somewhere between 0 and 1. And that will give you a positive tilt. If you go negative, so you go from 0 to -1, that gives you a negative tilt. Most people prefer putting in a negative tilt. You boost a little bit more on the low ends, and then your high ends are diminished. I wouldn't go the full strength of a -1. I typically go around 0.5. So this would be about 4 dBs plus or minus on the tilt. So we're not going to do any of that. I've taken off all the extra things that we just used to show you representatively of what all these components do. And we left the defaults, the high frequency roll-off 1 and the mid-range compensation. And we're going to just play with this to see what comes out of the box if you do nothing, right? We'll move on to filter settings. And here you're looking at each group, stereo pair, they're showing you left and right, and where there's just one, like the center, it's just showing you that. But you can bring in the curtains here. By default, the filter settings, it brings you from the low frequency cutoff to the top of the audible range. That's where they're putting the curtains by default. Then you have your low frequency EQ limit. So if you want to take it off of auto, you can make that adjustment. Right? Play with where that is. And then you have your high frequency EQ limit, and you can bring that down. Now, a lot of people say they don't want to do anything over 2000 Hertz. By default, this is set into 20,000 Hertz. Now there's another setting next to high frequency EQ limit. Are you going to limit everything coming out of Audyssey? So you just end up with nothing done over where this, so if you did set it to 2000 Hertz, for example, nothing be applied. Or if you set it to limit measured, then the measurements won't have any effect on the results over 2000 Hertz. Your EQ adjustments will still be made. So once you get this filter settings where you want, you can move on. We're leaving it at the defaults once again. Calibration settings, number 6. You can override the auto detected settings here for the trim, for the distance, for the detected cutoff, and the bass management. And again, it's showing you if there is a phase problem, or if it didn't detect one of your speakers, it's going to indicate that. This is kind of like a summary, but you get your last chance to go in and move something from small to large or large to small and set your frequencies on your bass management. Set your crossover points if you want to do that. Once you have this all set, and when you're ready to finalize, they're giving you a choice of how to initially set parameters after transfer. Don't get too worried about this because you've got all the control in your receiver, your processor. You can turn these things on and off at will after the transfer. How do you want it? You want MultEQ, filters turned on. That's what the output of this is. Do you want it turned on by default? Do you want it on reference or flat? Do you want dynamic volume? It's going to raise low volume and lowers high volume passages to the preferred levels, whether it's heavy, medium, light, or off. It's going to do dynamic EQ. So it's just when you're playing non-reference levels. So if you're not playing at 0 dB, it's going to raise both the lows and the highs. Not always desirable. Lows maybe, the highs, some people like it. But I think better to do it with your target curve, what you want, than to use the dynamic one. You can put a reference offset on this, 0 for movies, 5 dBs for wide dynamic classical music, 10 dBs for jazz, and then 15 dBs for very compressed music, like a lot of rock and pop is compressed. Then you have low frequency containment. So if you want to be friendly to your neighbors and not have as much vibration and bass, you can vary that between 1 and 7. 7 gives you more of a containment. 4 is the default if you turn it on. We're not turning it on. We're in a basement, no neighbors close by. And then you can transfer the files. Now there is an optional note at the bottom, and you can give a helpful note about your session of your calibration. But then you go hit the transfer, and this sends it to your Denon Marantz AV receiver or processor. Now, what we like to do is listen to it for a little bit and see if we like the results. Then we do a little measurement. We showed this with the Dirac calibration. I think this is important. It helps kind of balance out what you hear for, okay, why might it be doing it? Impartial judge here. If you're trying to see how well time-aligned your speakers are, measure your left and right speakers separately rather than left plus right. Then you can see how closely they match. If they're skewed a bit, they're not timed aligned. If they're lined up on the chart, then they're time aligned in a good way. Now, Anthem Arc has real-time measurements. We've heard that this is not possible with Denon Marantz without some extensive firmware updates, maybe hardware updates. When you're comparing, you're often better to do your critical listening with 2-channel. It's a lot easier to figure things out than to turn everything on. You might still want to do that, but start with 2-channel. That's my advice. When you're doing test tones, you're checking levels, use something external. You don't want to use the test tones built in your Denon Marantz because they bypass Audyssey. So you're not getting the tones with the Audyssey applied. But if you use something external, like the Spatial Audio Calibration Kit that can do up to a 9.1.6 speaker layout, and you can use REW. You can just get, that's what I've been using for just left and right. Pink noise limited bands are used by THX, so they're using 5 to 2000 for mains, 30 to 80 for the subs, similar to the way Audyssey is handling things. We listened a little bit to the MultEQ-X results for music and for the most part, and 2-channel listening and stuff. And it didn't sound as good as the Dirac calibrations that we did in the last sessions. And we know there's more work to be done. And in fact, if we take a look at the REW measurements that we did, and we did left and right channels here, you know, this isn't a nice looking chart here. We have a dip happening at 55 Hertz. The lines are definitely not timed aligned between left and right channels, and this is just 2 channels. So we're not getting a solid calibration of this. We got to go back into MultEQ-X and do another session. So, you know, what are your thoughts on this calibration? You know, this was designed really as a tutorial of how to use MultEQ-X. We're going to get into the fine-tuning a little bit more the next session to see if we can get as good or better than what we got out of Dirac Live. I know a lot of people are saying that they prefer MultEQ-X when used with a Denon Marantz product or Dirac Live, just the state of the integrations and so forth. But what are your thoughts? Have any experience with this? It's certainly a powerful tool, gives you a lot of options within it. My feeling is with Dirac, with limited knowledge, you can get great results. With the MultEQ-X, you really got to know what you're doing and get all those settings right before you can take it up to that next level. But again, we want that feedback. And if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. And if you want to take your involvement to the next level, you can visit our Patreon channel at www.patreon.com/Ripewave. You can also hit that thanks button for a one-time donation, always appreciated. And it costs nothing to hit the bell notification so you're notified when the next video is posted. Until then, keep evolving your audio experience.